Hello, everybody, and welcome to Extend Agile and DevOps Practices Across Hybrid IT. We'll be starting our webinar in 1 to 2 minutes as soon as everybody gets settled, so hold on. All right, everybody, and welcome to Extend Agile and DevOps Practices Across Hybrid IT webinar, brought to you by DevOps.com and CA Technologies. I would argue that no journey is going to be complete to DevOps without a long stop at the mainframe. So today, Vaughn Marshall, Senior Principal Product Manager, is going to discuss what it's going to take DevOps to multiple platforms that include the mainframe. Vaughn, take it from here.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So let me introduce myself. I'm Vaughn Marshall. I'm a Senior Principal Product Manager at CA Technologies. In particular, I'm responsible for application development tools that we have in our product portfolio. One in particular called CA Endevor SCM, which has for many years been the foundation for DevOps in a lot of organizations. So I'll be talking about that, as well as in general how DevOps has evolved and where mainframe fits in. So during the presentation, I will be talking about some things that are not yet GA or generally available. And as such, we just put this slide in to let everybody know that things can change at any point in time. We don't anticipate that they will, but just in case, we want to make that disclaimer. Okay, so before we kind of dive into DevOps and the mainframe, what I wanted to do was set the stage and really talk about, where mainframe's been and where it is today, and then really look at why DevOps is important. So, if you've been watching the space for a long time, you'll probably know that mainframe is something that a lot of people thought at one point was a platform that would be disappearing from the landscape. But yet here we are, it's 2018, well into the 21st century, and mainframe is showing no signs of going away. As a matter of fact, if we look at some of the stats that are up here on the screen, we can see it actually seems that it is growing. We look at the number of different companies that are expecting growth in their MIPS consumption, 78%. If we look at the number of Kix transactions that are happening per second, 1.3 million. Interestingly, if you contrast that with Google searches, you'd see that Google searches per second worldwide are probably around the order of, or not probably, sorry, but are around the order of 60,000 per second. So this absolutely dwarfs that. And it just shows how important mainframe is. And of course, it hasn't disappeared. What's happening actually is that a lot of companies are recommitting to mainframe. But despite that, mainframe was one of those platforms that people thought, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's favor stability over change. And so as the world kind of went and started adopting Agile and of course in turn DevOps to support Agile, a lot of times that was done in the newer platforms, and the mainframe was kind of left off to the side. So where we stand right now, 49% lack standardized Agile development in the mainframe space, and even more lack DevOps practices. So fast forward to 2018, And what we're seeing is that companies have had, while they've been adopting Agile and DevOps in their mobile cloud and distributed platforms, they're starting to see a lot of returns on that. And those are the companies that are doing better when it comes to their competitors. And as such, now that we're kind of looking at the mainframe in a new light as something that's not necessarily going away, but something that is really actually a critical platform for a lot of organizations, they're starting to say, hey, maybe we need to bring mainframe into the fold. And so in the last couple of years, mainframe DevOps and Agile transformation has become a very hot topic. So we did a little survey before our webinar around the different the different organizations that are part of the survey, and came up with some statistics. So these are pretty interesting, actually. If you look at how long it currently takes to update a mainframe application using today's practices, at least half require at least a month. And that's an incredible amount of time in this day and age. And if we even look further down, a quarter are even longer, quarterly. They can only update their mainframe applications, even for nominal changes, 4 times a year. And a lot of that is due to processes that are in place and have been for many years, certainly not agile practices, but more probably waterfall practices. And so, even though mainframe is a critical part, it's something that is acting to hold companies back. And if we look again, like I said, because of that, and now that people are recommitting to the mainframe, we're seeing that a lot of people are trying to figure out, well, how do I bring mainframe into the DevOps fold? And on the left, you'll see that there's a number of interesting statistics. 50% of the companies surveyed describe that transition as a work in progress. In other words, it's something that they are working on, but not necessarily, all the way through, or maybe having trouble with. And if we look at why, 56% cite organizational inertia, and I think that's actually a pretty incredible stat. If you think about it, what they're really saying there is that they want to do things the way they've always done things, and that it is difficult to enact change when you do things a certain way. And we'll look at that a little closer into the presentation. So let's dive in and talk a little bit about some of the challenges around DevOps practices, and in particular continuous delivery. So in terms of that organizational inertia, right? What are the things that are kind of standing in the way and making people say, "Hey, it's going to be a tough road to transform, and therefore let's just kind of keep doing what we're doing." So some of the proof points here: the next generation of developers wants to use modern tools. So that really speaks to where mainframe's been and where it's going. So if you recall from the outset, I mentioned how many people had thought for quite some time that mainframe was something that you wouldn't really see in 2018, but of course they were completely incorrect. But those same people often didn't really say, the same organizations didn't really train up that next generation of developers. And so now what we have is a new generation that is being trained up rather quickly, but it's tough to attract them and necessary and to train them because while they may have no issues working on the mainframe platform and using mainframe languages, they really want to be able to use modern tools. In other words, they're not exactly enamored with green screens. And so it can become difficult to address that skills gap. We also have, as I mentioned, the enterprise. They have been the ones driving DevOps on the cloud, mobile, and distributed platforms. And as we look to bring the mainframe into the fold, they want to standardize on a common stack. They don't want to have special tools for mainframe, and as such, we're hearing a lot of things like tools like Git and Jenkins, and questions about how do we use that in the context of mainframe, because again, that's where the next generation of developers is used to using tools, and that's where the enterprise prefers to standardize. So a lot of people that are looking at kind of taking mainframe into the 21st century are wondering, what's the right approach to transformation? They want to know, do we just burn everything down and replace it with Git? How much would that cost? And of course, once you start peeling back that onion, you realize that mainframe has a ton of automation in it, and it's been there for years. There's audit and government requirements, and that doing a full out rip and replace is a lot more complicated, costly, and risky than it would seem. So we have this drive to standardize on tools that people are familiar with, but at the same time, we've got things that we've invested in over years that we don't want to necessarily throw away. And then, of course, that's going to maybe make the next generation, or the enterprise happy. But what about those seasoned mainframers that have been using green screen for many, many years and that are productive in it and want to stay productive? What about them? Do we have, if we kind of start over with modern tools, how are they going to stay productive and relevant? So there's that dichotomy as well. So before we dive into kind of how we can maybe address some of these, let's actually take a look at what they are doing, in a modern DevOps Agile stack outside of the world of mainframe. So here's a picture of kind of a typical DevOps stack. You can see over here on the left-hand side, you have, one of many different Agile tools, say TFS, Jira, Agile Central. All of these are basically tools that track your work. Generally, they are feeding that work to developers in an integrated context in their development environment, their IDE, and you can see that we've got a couple kind of the market leaders, Eclipse and IntelliJ in the Java space, and Visual Studio for .NET, and of course the world of IDEs is even exploding more than that. And then of course those IDEs are tightly integrated into version control systems like Git, Subversion, or TFS, and further those systems are generally integrated into the Agile tool, so developers making changes can see exactly what those changes are for, what user stories and defects and so on. And of course, when a developer makes a change from their graphical IDE in the SCM, the most successful teams have a continuous integration, continuous delivery set up so that it's automatically taking those changes and doing things like builds. So, they'll have a tool like Jenkins that is driving an underlying build tool like Maven or maybe MS Build if you're doing .NET. And on the front end of that, they'll have integrated in application static analysis tools, so code quality tools, things like SonarQube, things like Cast. They'll have integrated in unit testing tools, things like JUnit or NUnit. And then ultimately, after passing all of those gates, the net will be the output of binaries. And those end up in a binary repository. So from there, you will have some sort of continuous delivery tool, pulling the binaries out and moving it through a delivery process that will involve a number of different states and stages, usually with automated testing happening along the way. And you may have those things. Doing a mix of automated and manual tests, but ultimately it is coordinating the move through to production. Okay, so that's what's going on, in a modern DevOps stack. Essentially, you've got the developers being able to use the same process to deploy through the life cycle all the way to production, and be able to work with smaller changes instead of big bang planned out releases, in a waterfall fashion, and they're able to be very productive and very nimble. So let's step back and look at, well, contrast that anyways with what's happening in the world of mainframe. What do we have on the mainframe? So I'm the product manager, like I said, of CA Endevor SCM, and that is a market-leading tool for software configuration management on the mainframe. And actually, if we look at what it does, there you can see that there's actually a foundation for these practices already in place. So as a matter of fact, Endeavour is an acronym that stands for Environment for Development and Operations. So I like to actually think of it as the original DevOps tool. Essentially, you're doing many of the same practices with tools like this. You are, yes, doing version control, but in addition, when I'm making changes, I'm automatically doing things like builds, doing things like kicking off mainframe tests. So in effect, I'm performing continuous integration. That automation is powered by something called processors. You can even think of these as kind of like your build scripts. And associated with Endeavour is a lifecycle, or an SDLC. And you promote up that lifecycle. So essentially what you have there is a CI/CD pipeline managed in Endeavour. And so basically the binaries that are coming out of your build process are getting packaged up and moved up that lifecycle. And you have special jobs that are running to automate that process along the way. So if I go back to my picture over here and place where Endeavour would kind of fit in that, I can overlay it, and you can see it actually covers almost all of it. And as a matter of fact, if you consider things like our Eclipse plugin to Endeavour, or even our Quick Edit interface, you really have kind of even overlap into the IDE area. So there's a foundation there for DevOps on the mainframe, and maybe it doesn't need to be ripped out. It doesn't need it. We don't necessarily need to start over, so to speak. So if we think back to that organizational inertia, right? That thing that's kind of keeping us from starting because the task looks so daunting. Maybe it doesn't need to be. And so what I think, and a lot of my colleagues think, is a better approach to bringing the mainframe in the fold and to kind of satisfy all of the demands on the organization, that skills gap that's coming with the next generation of developers, the fact that we want to standardize on tools, is to really start to see tools like Endeavour as a engine that provides kind of that underlying automation that teams have invested in for years and years and years, and really, instead of removing it, interface to it. So instead of taking Endeavour out, what we'd really be doing is driving it from some of the more modern tools. And what is the advantage of that? If you look at it on the hood, all of those things that I said about Endeavour are true, but for instance, you may not be able to easily see a pipeline from Endeavour because you're working in the green screen. So if you want that visualization that you get for, say, a pipeline delivery tool, then you would interface into what Endeavour is doing with its packaging already. And then developers can visualize what's happening. And with that interface, you could use, if you wanted, the most popular vendor and open source tools. So in other words, you could start to adopt those same tools that the enterprise wants to use. So you can standardize. And then you have a common view of what's happening without necessarily having to start over. And it becomes a much easier prospect. And by standardizing, you're not adding in new niche tools for the mainframe. So for instance, if you one approach might be, hey, let's adopt new tools on the mainframe that do certain things, maybe with a nicer interface than the ones that we used 30 years ago. But again, you're going down that road of another another set of niche tools for the mainframe, which ultimately translates into silos. And I think in this day and age, what we want to do is move towards a position where mainframe is no different than any other platform, whether it's Linux, Unix, Windows. It is a resource. It happens to be the resource that is probably best suited for incredibly large workload transaction processing, but I can interface into it from whatever I prefer to use. Now, of course, there's some advantages to layering on top these new tools. Now, yes, things like Endeavour had a foundation in automation on the mainframe, but these days, hybrid IT is probably more closely aligned to the things that we're making changes in and testing. So, for instance, I may want to make a change on the mainframe, but then drive automated testing through the UI or even the middleware layer or even the service layer. And so my testing tools that I want to kick off in a highly automated pipeline might not live on the mainframe. So having the layer of tools driving the mainframe automation that exists, but giving the capability of adding in new tools that maybe don't live on the mainframe is very advantageous. And of course, the other benefit here is that you're going to have, like I said, those traditional mainframe programmers who've been very productive in green screen. If we're using layers to drive things on top, but we're not necessarily dictating that you have to use these things, that those who are productive on the green screen can continue to be productive on the green screen. And of course, by taking this layering approach, we're not looking at having to do a conversion. And so again, to me, this all kind of goes back to that organizational inertia, right? I'm addressing that head on. We can continue to do things the way we've doing things, but what we're doing instead is layering on additional capabilities and doing that with little risk and minimal costs. We don't have to spend years converting code, testing things, making sure processes aren't broken, and so on. Starting over is really something that I think companies have absolutely no appetite for. And if you think about it, this actually mirrors exactly what's happening in the systems that these developers are maintaining. So, for instance, you've got the mainframe as something that has been there for many, many years, and developers have worked on, and that does all the transaction processing. And when the distributed systems kind of came online, there was no wholesale appetite to convert everything off. Instead, what we did was built up layers. So soon there was middleware and web interfaces. Now we have mobile interfaces. And so kind of looking at just how systems evolve in general, you see this layering happening. And I think that should be no different. And the reasons that drive that are no different than the development tools we use to maintain those systems themselves. So to that end, we're introducing a new option for Endeavour SCM, which we wanted to feature today, called CA Endevor SCM Integrations for Enterprise DevOps. So again, Endeavour is a DevOps tool, always has been. What this does is really bring that to the enterprise level and the hybrid IT level. It's a new option that allows you to layer on top of Endeavour popular Agile and DevOps tools. Right, so you can use the lifecycle automation that companies have invested in for many, many years, and you can continue to get value out of that. What it really does is it extends Endeavour's value to the world of hybrid IT. So let's talk a little bit about what's in that. Ultimately, you've got a lot of different options with Endeavour, and those options still exist in terms of your ways of interacting with Endeavour. So in the base product, we include the Eclipse plugin. So again, if you are using an Eclipse-based IDE, you have that option as a modern interface. So don't get me wrong that you don't have to always be in green screen today, but it is a specialized IDE and it is Eclipse-based. We also introduced very recently a product called CA Brightside. And ultimately what that is a command line interface for the mainframe. a lot of people scratch their heads and wonder what the impact of that is, but it's actually pretty amazing. What it allows you to do is interact with tools like the mainframe as though they are a service. And Endeavour becomes almost a DevOps automation service. I can interact with it from many different places. The command line happens to be something I can interact with in pretty much any system. So if I'm working on a Unix box, I can interact with Endeavour. If I'm working on my Mac laptop, I can interact with Endeavour. And furthermore, I can script it. And if you think about what a lot of DevOps tools use, it's really driven around scripting. So this provides that interface in there. And that's part of core Endeavour. So anyways, regardless of what you're going to use, right? If you're going to use those interfaces, you can. But what this new option brings to the table is really a whole world of other integrations. I'll drive into that in a second. But this is where we see, pictorially, the mainframe in general in the world of hybrid DevOps. And in particular, our product, Endevor SCM. So you've got kind of this heart that provides all of these services, right? From version control to CI/CD to a binary repo to a release pipeline, and all of these options to integrate with it, driving that. And here we have the CA Endevor integrations for Enterprise DevOps, or even our sister product Brightside, which give you capability to really drive into that. And so let's look a little bit closer at one of the marquee features. So one of the key things that comes with the Endeavour integration, integrations for Enterprise DevOps, is a plugin for Enterprise Git repositories. So let's talk about that. Why is that a marquee feature? Why is that so important? Why is Git something that everybody's asking about? So Git is essentially a version control system that was developed really by the open source community to support work on tools like Linux and the Linux kernel. And built into it is an incredible capability around collaboration and being able to do things like trade branches with each other. It is a distributed version control system, so it's not centralized. People can have their own mini version control system on their laptop and collaborate easily. It has become incredibly popular in the enterprise because of its advanced branch and merge capability and the ability to easily merge changes from other developers. And as such, it becomes something that a lot of developers are very, very used to. It's becoming a de facto standard in the enterprise. It is a easy to onboard tool because developers are using this in college, they're using this as they work in open source projects, and it is a very common skill set. And as such, I would be willing to bet that most of your enterprises probably have some sort of enterprise Git repository that they're using off of the mainframe. Right, and so the popular ones are things like Atlassian's Bitbucket, GitHub, GitLab. All of those things are enterprise Git repositories and probably present in your organization. And so a lot of people saying, hey, I want to be able to use that on the mainframe too. So again, supporting a common experience for developers regardless of what platforms they're using, right? And again, what's driving that is that it is popular and proven for collaboration. So there's this kind of I'll call it a demand that's swelling up in the world of development around being able to adopt Git, and a lot of people want to use it on the mainframe as well. But then if that's the case, well, why Endeavour? So if you look at it, right, Git is essentially version control. It doesn't provide with it all of the automation that is typical in tools like Endeavour. In Endeavour, you have a heavy investment in lifecycle automation as well as version control. So, you've got millions of different code assets that are historically in tools like Endeavour. They're secured, their deployments are automated. They have built decades of automation into the tools themselves around build, test, deploy. And if you wanted to use just Git, you would be having to come up with a replacement for that. So we think it actually makes much more sense to use the best of both worlds. Now, our front end targets a number of different personas. So at CA, when we're coming up with new apps and things, we like to think about things in terms of different personas and what are their needs. We have one called Michelle. Michelle is our next-gen developer, codes off-host apps, but also has responsibility for mainframe maintenance, but is really put off by things like green screen, would much prefer to use open source tools, things like Git and IDEs. That's their comfort zone. Contrast that with Rob, who is a traditional seasoned mainframer who's 99.9% maintaining apps on the mainframe and is productive in tools like ISPF, Kix, and pretty much all things green screen, and really doesn't have much interest in working in modern tools. Really, we like to think of both these people. We think this Git bridge is something that would be really targeting the newer developers, but not necessarily meaning that a wholesale conversion has to happen. We think that there's room for Rob and Michelle to collaborate. So what we want to do is really be able to think of a mainframe DevOps experience that supports all these developers. So ultimately, something that will allow Michelle to work on the mainframe and not necessarily have to go on the green screen. And of course, if we think of Git, and our new option, which it brings with it a Git bridge for Endeavour, that will allow Michelle to work in Endeavour and have her changes synchronized up into Endeavour. That's only half the battle, though. There's a lot of automation, and that's where things like the Brightside command line interface would allow her to integrate through pipeline tools and so on. So ultimately, there's no need for green screens. So this is kind of a picture of what we think that world looks like, right? Again, Endeavour is kind of sitting here, and your mainframe automation in general that we've spent many, many years building up is sitting here and continuing to provide that, only now it's a service. So you may have the Robs of the world going in and working on the green screen to do these things, but for that next generation of developers or the enterprise or any developer that wants to kind of layer in modern tools and bring in all of those processes to have a hybrid DevOps experience, you have our option. Underpinned by the Enterprise Git repository. So the developers who want to would be working with Git and being able to check in and out to their enterprise repository. And what's happening is a sync is automatically happening between the mainframe and what's going on in Git. Now, this is hard to overstate. The Git bridge into Endeavour provides a whole world of integration. And the first one that I would say is super important is the IDE. So if you recall, the world of modern tools has an explosion of different IDEs. And ultimately, developers want to be able to choose what tools they remain the most productive in. And we as a company just can't build plugins for every single tool out there. But good news, the community of developers at large does do that. And of course, the integration of choice is Git. So pretty much every IDE out on the market has some sort of Git interface, whether it's Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, even TFS can integrate into Git. Same with Eclipse, IntelliJ, they all have Git interfaces. And so by putting that Git layer on top of your mainframe and layering that on, you really are opening up a world of IDE choice. And of course, as I said, you still need something to move things through the pipeline. And so you can either do that through interactive control with things like Brightside, or you can build that right into your CD tool. And there's other integrations too as well that come with the with our Endeavour integrations for Enterprise DevOps, you can have things like changes in Endeavour automatically syncing into your Agile tool and so on. So the idea again is all of those things that we talked about in that distributed DevOps stack are built in as layers on top of what you've used for many years with great success in layers. So a little bit more about how this works. We have, as I say, a number of different options. Endeavour itself actually has a feature called sandboxes, which you can think of as feature branches. There are feature branches that are dynamically created, and one way to work is to have a feature branch basically synced with GitHub or GitLab, and that prevents anybody who's making changes in on the mainframe, their changes won't be visible in the feature branch, and so you won't have collisions, right? You'll have whoever's working on in Git using the normal Git methodology for dealing with and collaborating, and their changes will be going into their merged changes will be going into a owned feature branch in Endeavour, and then whoever is working directly on the mainframe would merge from that branch into the main trunk line of the code for promotion. So that's one option. That would probably favor teams which are largely mainframers, but maybe have a few people that want to work in Git. Another option is to essentially do all of the merging in Git through the push mechanism. So ultimately what happens is you've got whoever is working in Git, working with the Git repo, and essentially when the synchronization happens into Endeavour, it's looking at whether or not we have changes coming in from other developers that are working directly on the mainframe. And if there's any synchronization or collision issues, then what it can do is it can reject the push and have the developers deal with the merge through an automated process in Git itself. So ultimately, this one would probably favor teams where a large component of the developers are working off host, or where you want to have each individual developer being able to deal with conflicts in their tool of choice. So some of the things in our initial release of this, and again, this is just one of the many features that are in the integrations for Enterprise DevOps. We have, but we think, again, the Git layer is probably a marquee feature. We have initial support for Atlassian Bitbucket, which is a very popular enterprise Git repo. We have the ability to reject pushes, so that way of managing in workspace merges. We have the ability to check in to build sandboxes from a feature branch, and we also have the ability to support things like Git flow through multiple branches inside the repo being mapped to different parts of your Endeavour lifecycle. So all of that is available now. We're also working on GitHub and GitLab support, and with that, we believe we will be able to cover 90% of the enterprise Git repo market. We are also putting in some work to do preemptive syncing back to Git, which will reduce collisions, making sure people are working on branches that are up to date, and another option for mapping different systems and subsystems, in particular via folders and not just branches. So just to recap, and then what I want to do is I guess leave some time for questions and answers. Ultimately, we think that the best approach to hybrid IT and maintaining mainframe as part of an enterprise approach to DevOps is to layer and take an integration-based approach as a fast path, right? And the reason for that, again, conversions, inertia, all of those things are barriers, right? If you start to try to peel back the onion and figure out how am I going to fold in my mainframe processes to my enterprise processes, and you start to consider conversions, new tools, etc. Even ones that are very popular and standardized in the world of distributed, it's just turns into a logistical nightmare and takes years. So essentially what ends up happening is you're wasting time and money while your competition is racing ahead of you. And again, there's no guarantee that any of that works out in your favor. So again, it doesn't make it makes total sense actually that there would be inertia as one of the prime barriers to adopting DevOps for the mainframe. It's just when you look at it, it's a lot more complicated than it would appear to be. So a better approach in a nutshell, and again, if you're an Endeavour customer, CA's Endevor Integrations for Enterprise DevOps really takes this approach, but we think a better approach is to sit on top of what you have, right? Take what you've got, layer on top of it, take core mainframe tools and processes and make them really act more like a service, and then layer on the tools you want to use as a developer to basically enable that choice of interface. And that might be things like Eclipse, it might be things like Git, it might be your Agile tool, it might be your CI/CD tool driving all the automation you've already got. It could be tools like your enterprise release automation platform. And again, CA's got a wonderful choice there in CA continuous delivery automation. Whatever it is, those things are all basically calling out, layered on top of things that you've invested on in for years, the DevOps processes that have been there for many, many years, and you're able to quickly, basically take that fast path to modernization and not take on the risk of getting left behind while you're stuck doing an expensive conversion that may or may not work. So I will stop there. I think that leaves us 20 minutes for questions, and I will wait.
All right, great. That was impressive. I guess, we can actually see how proverbial old dogs on the mainframe are going to learn new tricks, but just as importantly, pups are going to learn something about how world-class IT actually operates. With that, I want to draw your attention to the Ask a Question feature on your screen. We're going to invite everybody to ask some questions. And with that, let's jump to our first question, which is, can you explain just how does the sync condition get handled within Git per se?
Sure. So I think the question is referring to what's called an out of sync condition. So essentially, in tools like Endeavour, which apart from using tools like sandboxes can be very much pessimistic, trunk based and so on. If you've got multiple developers working, let's say in their own sandboxes and whatnot, and one developer is working with a version of prod code that they copied back, and the other developer is working with prod code, and that first developer makes their change and starts promoting it up the lifecycle, then that second developer doesn't have that first developer's changes in their code base. So what happens is they have a conflict. They are basically going to get a out of sync issue. And the same thing can happen when we are working with layers on top of Endeavour, like Git. The difference being, of course, how do you deal with those two systems, right? What happens when Endeavour says it's out of sync? Are you going to clobber the code and so on? So what actually happens is when with the new integration option, the API that we talk to is able to kind of put a fingerprint on where the code came from. So when the check-in happens from Git, and it goes essentially to synchronize, it will compare and make sure that the changes in Git came from that same version that matches that fingerprint. And if it doesn't, then what happens is the push or the sync gets rejected. And ultimately, it's up to the developer to pull the latest changes into Git and then use Git's capability around merging, and then re-push, and at which point the sync condition will have been resolved. So that's basically how that works.
All right, great.
Yep, go ahead.
I guess test automation is core to DevOps on any platform, but one of our attendees wants to know if you have any recommendations for any particular tool in that category.
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's many different tools out there around test, and it all really kind of boils down to what level of test you're doing. So in terms of unit testing, there are tools like ZUnit out there, which can help you generate unit test cases from some of your existing code monoliths. You will need to kind of treat your code monolith as a unit itself, just because of the way things were architected back when a lot of these programs were written. And that runs right on the mainframe, though it can be called and driven through external interfaces like everything else. There are also approaches to what you do for integration testing. And I think that's where folding in that next layer of automation tools is important. And the answer there is, I would say, test at the service layer. That's really where the mainframe kind of acts. It's acting as that system of record. The system of engagement is obviously driving, requests through the service layer and displaying them. So if you want to kind of have an automated testing and you want to use the same sets of tools that you're using in the modern enterprise, then really treat the mainframe in the same way, right? And write your tests at that service layer. And that enables you to do things like use standardized load testing tools. You can use, tools like Selenium to test the web interfaces, if there's web APIs and things like that. It really just depends on the tools. So the thing is that now with this new layer on top of your mainframe code, that layers in hybrid IT, it means that your whole process can be automated. Whereas before you might have had maybe somebody going onto the mainframe and executing a package or something to do a promotion, and then they would have to email somebody and say, okay, we're ready for a test, right? If you want to automate your pipeline and really bring in those new capabilities, if you're driving everything from, let's say, a CI/CD tool like either CA Continuous Delivery Director or something like that, then you can now, through these interfaces, do your promotion on the mainframe and then kick off your tests off host. So that's really, I think test, again, it's kind of fits into Git, which we mentioned specifically. It opens up that whole world of automation that is now hybrid, right, in nature, and really means that mainframe can be pulled into those enterprise processes, and therefore use those enterprise tools.
All right, our next question is somebody who wants a little more detail on the planned support for GitHub, and specifically some info on some timetables if you're willing to commit.
Wow, that's a tough one. GitHub is, I can tell you we're working on it now. We're hoping to have a prototype at the end of, we work here at CA, we obviously follow Agile methodologies, and in particular, we follow SAFe. So we work in something called program increments. We're hoping to have one at the end of our program increment. That's pretty much every 3 months, every quarter. Of course, we're also hoping to have interim builds. So one thing I would recommend is going out to validate.ca.com. If you're interested, you can actually sign up and get interim builds and things like that. But I'd say that probably in the next couple of PIs, we're hoping to have our GA version of the GitHub plugin.
All right, great. Another one of our attendees wants a little more information on what requirements need to be met to actually put all this stuff on the mainframe, like what versions, what base units of software. Can you walk people through that a little bit?
Sure, that's actually that's a great question. Yeah, so in terms of what you need on the mainframe to make all this work, so ultimately, all of these interfaces that we're layering on top of things are being done through things that live on the mainframe. But what we're trying to do is, use the same layers that we've been using for a number of years. So, for instance, for Endeavour, Endeavour has a web services component, and you need to have that web services stood up. That is what all of these integrations talk to. It's the same thing that we've been using to integrate things like our Eclipse plugin into. And so those web services definitely need to be stood up. If you're talking about things like Brightside, which I had mentioned, which kind of integrate with Endeavour, those also use the web services, but it also can talk to things like ZOS management facility. So that's another layer that's part of the operating system. Doesn't need to be stood up in particular, but all of those things are basically standard interfaces that live on the mainframe, have been there prior to this option being released. One thing though to be aware of for Endeavour, as this is a relatively new option, it's taking advantage of some new web service capability. So you need to be on the GA release of Endeavour, which is 18.012, the GA release that we put out, I believe, at the end of April.
All right, and then our next question goes to credentials, and people want to know just how are something like Git versus mainframe credentials handled?
Yeah, that's a question I hear quite a bit. So once we start talking about the mainframe and interfaces to it, the next thing that generally pops up is, well, what about security? And so the good news is the answer is that none of these interfaces are using special security. Ultimately, we are talking to, the mainframe web services and ultimately making requests on the mainframe and integrating with the mainframe. And so we're using mainframe security for that, right? We're using your TSO ID. It's ultimately getting passed in to those services through the APIs. So for Git in particular, the plugins into the enterprise repos, they add layers on top of your profile where you can store your mainframe ID. It is encrypted as part of the enterprise repos secrets store, and it is basically something that you will need to maintain as part of your profile. But ultimately, it's going to be you're not going to be able to do anything on the mainframe that you couldn't do otherwise, because it is a mainframe ID and it is managed and secured using mainframe security products and so on. So that's basically it. That's how credentials work pretty much across all of the different interfaces we talked about, whether it's Eclipse, Brightside, Git, anything that's going in. It's sending mainframe IDs encrypted into the web services. And of course that, is the web services themselves are secured in a number of different ways, things like SSL and TLS and so on.
All right, you talked about inertia during your presentation, and I just wanted to ask you real quick, is that changing though as we start to see more of Linux and Java on mainframe environments? Or are we starting to see more APIs touch digital processes that include the mainframe? So where are we culturally on the mainframe?
Well, that's a great question. I think, when I speak about inertia, I mean, I'm talking about not so much the demand. I think we're at a point culturally on the mainframe where, again, if I rewind, let's say 20 years, mainframe was something that everybody thought was going to be gone. Right? We're all switching to open systems, open source is eating the world. And of course, fast forward to now, is not gone, and it shows no signs of going. It's actually growing. And so now there's this demand culturally to start paying attention to the mainframe. So it's understandable that, 20 years ago, people who thought a platform was going to go away maybe didn't think about, well, let's try, transformation, DevOps, Agile, et cetera. And now they're realizing that is absolutely not happening. Mainframe is something that's going to be here for many, many years, and therefore we need to bring it into the fold. And so that demand is there. I think the inertia comes in from peeling back the onion and figuring out, okay, well, what's going to be the cost to fold that in? How do we do it? What about all of the automation we have in place that a lot of people rely on, and as people are retiring, maybe even we're starting to get to the point that that automation becomes somewhat of a black box. You use it, but maybe not 100% sure how all of it works, and so it just becomes more and more complicated. So it contributes to inertia in the fact that it's a barrier. Culturally, I think we are absolutely at the space where we want to bring mainframe into the fold. It's just that, like everything else, it becomes insurmountable if you don't take the right approach. So I think culturally, yes, absolutely, all of these different things. The fact that we're putting APIs on the mainframe and so on, they're only making these questions more important. There's more demand. There's more people saying, "Hey, we need to do something about this. We need to go faster. We can't have, we can't be releasing changes, competitive changes in our mobile and web applications, every day, every week, when it takes us every quarter to change the back end." So I think it's definitely driving it. It's just, I think that the barrier is not knowing where to start, or looking at the costs and going, wow, this is going to be painful to do. And that's why we think the approach is really layer instead of, you deal with the barrier by looking at what you have instead and layering on top of that to make things go faster.
Hey, Vaughn, I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So I'll put up this last slide. So these are my contact details. If anybody has any thoughts, questions, wants to know more about the new integrations option for Endeavour, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact me. Thank you again for all your time.
All right, guys, and a recording of this webinar, of course, will be found on devops.com, where you'll find all kinds of great webinars on the subject of DevOps. Thank you all for spending some time with us, and best of luck in your future DevOps endeavors.